I'd like to introduce my colleague William Nelson, who teaches European history here at UTSC, and he's a specialist in the history of France. William, we've been looking at the political impact of capitalism, particularly in the 18th and now the 19th centuries. And I wanted to ask you to take a few minutes and talk to us about the way in which European revolutions, particularly the French Revolution in the late 18th century, cleared the way for more dynamic sort of capitalism.
Yeah, the French Revolution is a very interesting case because although many of the people were involved in bringing about the revolution and determining its shape and what would come out of it, the types of laws, the type of society, the new kind of structures of life, did not necessarily intend to bring about a more dynamic form of capitalism, but they certainly cleared the way for a number of very significant changes that through the 19th century continued to develop and really brought about some of the features, the main features that we recognize as dynamic 19th century full-blown capitalism. One of the interesting big differences between the 18th century and 19th century in many parts of Europe, some parts of the world, is the existence in the 18th century of guilds and the kind of limitations on free labor. Guilds are a very interesting case because we might think of them as a somewhat, not just a small part of life, something that relates to work. But it wasn't just about work, it was about all of life, including work, and so much of life was through work. So people oftentimes were really, their identities came from being in a guild because not only was there a very strict restriction on who could enter the guild, it was primarily a legal monopoly determining who could be involved in doing a certain type of work or not, but also your whole social life usually revolved around the guild. So you go out, in a sense, drinking with your guild colleagues. At the end of the day, you would oftentimes have kind of celebrations for holidays and feast days with members of the guild. There'd be lots of initiations and rituals and a kind of a whole dynamic social life associated with the guild. It wasn't just about kind of the work you did during the day. Sometimes too, it was things like what we associate with kind of the modern safety net that exists more recently with kind of governments providing for things like kind of unemployment insurance or things of this sort. In the 18th century, there weren't too many protections that the government provided. It was usually provided by the guild. So if you got hurt while you're working, maybe the guild would be able to give your family some food, something of this sort. And so guilds were really these all-encompassing things, and people inside of them really kind of thought of themselves as primarily a member of the guild, even more so than being a member of a certain nation or a certain empire. And the French Revolution, kind of destroying that guild system, changed how people worked, but it also eventually changed how they saw themselves in relation to labor and kind of much more generally. So while before maybe your identity was through being a cobbler, making shoes, your whole social world was surrounded by that, after the French Revolution, there wasn't the same kind of identification necessarily with what you made. One of the very important things that this kind of created or allowed for, that set up in the 19th century, was for people to be separated from the labor they're doing, the product that they're producing maybe at the end stage. So your identity was no longer about the fact that you made shoes. Your identity increasingly in the 19th century became the fact maybe that you sold your labor, that you could be somebody who was selling your labor time rather than involved in some practice where your whole world was kind of mixed up with the things that you're producing. So that is a very large change. And it also created this kind of breaking up of the guild system, created a situation where you would have competition in the labor market. So in the 18th century, there was effectively no labor market, as we might think of it from a later period. Guilds were legal monopolies, restricting who could work in a certain profession. After the kind of dissolution of these guilds, there was this opening up. So in theory, people could be kind of getting into certain types of work and out of certain type of work much more easily, which allowed for the people who are employing them to compete for those laborers very differently. It's the reason why eventually labor unions are created to try and kind of combat and create some kind of control again of the labor market. One of the interesting things about the French Revolution, and the guilds are a great example of this, is that the destruction of the guilds was not intended to be kind of setting up some crazy new stage of capitalism, but it allowed for very significant changes that went beyond what people involved in the French Revolution foresaw or probably could have foreseen. So through the 19th century, you have a number of revolutions that are continuing that are political, but also social and economic, and increasingly the economic interests are more and more of a part of these revolutions. So people are attempting to, particularly the people who are coming into control of the labor market, people who are increasingly owning the kind of factories and the means of production, are trying to advance their economic interests through revolutions, through political revolutions, through changing laws in kind of dramatic fashions in revolutions. So the French Revolution is an important, and other 18th century, 19th century revolutions are an important thing allowing for this kind of dynamic development.